Picture this. The President of the United States tries to crush Canada with tariffs. Canada responds by building an entire food empire that will make American farmers irrelevant forever. This morning, Mark Carney stood in an Ottawa grocery store and announced $500 million to protect Canadian food supply chains. But this isn't defensive spending. This is Canada declaring economic independence from the United States in the most strategic sector possible: food. And here's the twist that should terrify every American agricultural exporter. Trump's tariff war didn't weaken Canada, it gave Carney the perfect excuse to do what Canada should have done decades ago: cut America out of the equation entirely. Today, we're breaking down how a 25% tariff became the catalyst for America losing billions in permanent agricultural exports, how Canada is about to become completely self-sufficient in food production, and why this might be the biggest strategic blunder of Trump's entire trade war. But first, if you want more deep dives like this, hit that like button and subscribe. Let's get into it. For decades, Canada and America didn't just trade food. They operated as one integrated system. Canadian beef moved south. American vegetables moved north. Supply chains crossed the border dozens of times before anything reached a grocery store. The entire North American food infrastructure was built on one assumption: the border would stay open. Then, Trump launched his tariff war: 25% on Canadian steel, 35% on non-trade agreement goods, threats of 100% tariffs if Canada even thinks about making deals with China. Suddenly, that integrated food system became a weapon, and Trump was holding the trigger. The damage was immediate and brutal. Beef prices collapsed 22%, pork exports fell 8%, canola shipments to the U.S. dropped sharply. Meanwhile, Canadian grocery prices surged 6.2% year over year. Canadian farmers were bleeding, supply chains fractured, consumers got hammered with higher costs. Trump thought this pain would force Canada to accept American terms on everything, capitulate on dairy, give ground on lumber, beg for market access. Instead, he handed Mark Carney a gift. Here's what Trump didn't understand. Threatening food security is existential. Countries tolerate economic pain in other sectors, but threaten their ability to feed their population. Governments act decisively. So, instead of negotiating, Carney went nuclear with investments. The $500 million Strategic Response Fund. This isn't a subsidy program, it's infrastructure investment designed to make Canadian food production completely independent from American supply chains. Canadian companies can now get funding to expand processing capacity, upgrade cold storage facilities, build distribution networks, eliminate every bottleneck that forces them to use American infrastructure. Let me give you a concrete example of how insane the current system is. Canada produces massive amounts of beef and pork, but it lacks domestic processing capacity. So Canadian cattle get shipped to American slaughterhouses, processed into cuts, then sold back to Canadian grocery stores at marked up prices. Trump's tariffs made this economically suicidal. Carney's response: build Canadian processing facilities that keep the entire supply chain domestic. But it gets better. There's a $150 million food security fund targeting greenhouses, and here's why this is strategic genius. Canada imports enormous quantities of fresh vegetables from California and Mexico because domestic greenhouse capacity can't meet winter demand. That dependency becomes a vulnerability when Trump threatens tariffs. So Carney introduced immediate expensing for greenhouse buildings. Any company that builds a greenhouse operational before 2030 can write off the entire cost immediately. That's a massive tax incentive to build domestic vegetable production capacity right now. And it's working. Canada has been expanding greenhouse operations aggressively: British Columbia, Ontario, Quebec. They're growing tomatoes, peppers, cucumbers, lettuce year-round. Within 5 years, Canada could be completely self-sufficient in greenhouse vegetables. That's billions in American imports disappearing permanently.
Now here's where this gets really interesting. This isn't just about surviving Trump's tariffs, it's about permanent structural change. Once Canada builds meat processing facilities, greenhouse operations, and distribution networks for domestic markets, they don't disappear when tariffs end. They become permanent infrastructure that reduces Canadian dependence on American agriculture forever. And American agricultural exporters are just now realizing what this means. Canada is a major market for U.S. produce, processed foods, and agricultural products. If Canada becomes self-sufficient in key categories, those export markets vanish, not temporarily, permanently. Trump's tariffs aren't just hurting current sales, they're destroying future market access. Let's talk about why greenhouse expansion is so brilliant strategically. Canada has short growing seasons. Without greenhouse infrastructure, fresh vegetables must be imported during winter from California, Mexico, warm climate producers. But modern greenhouse technology has advanced dramatically. LED lighting, climate control, hydroponics, they allow round-year production even in Canadian winters. Yes, it's energy intensive, but it's increasingly cost competitive when you factor in transportation and tariffs. Here's the kicker. Once greenhouse operations are built and operational, they don't require ongoing American inputs. They use Canadian energy, water, labor. They're immune to Trump's tariffs or any future trade disputes. They represent permanent food sovereignty. And this food plan isn't happening in isolation. It's part of Carney's comprehensive strategy to reduce Canadian dependence on the United States across every sector. The Buy Canadian procurement policy, $70 billion redirected to domestic suppliers over 5 years. Arctic infrastructure investment, building shipping routes to Europe and Asia. The China trade deal, unlocking agricultural exports to the world's largest consumer market. Every move reduces the leverage Trump's tariffs can generate. Now watch the strategic sequence Carney just executed. Trump threatens Canadian agriculture with tariffs. Canadian farmers panic. Carney responds with investment in domestic food infrastructure. Farmers realize they can serve Canadian markets without exporting to the U.S. Greenhouse operators expand rapidly with government support. Within 5 years, Canada becomes largely self-sufficient in key food categories. At that point, Trump's agricultural tariffs become irrelevant. Canadian producers aren't exporting to the U.S. anymore. They're serving domestic demand, and American agricultural exporters have permanently lost market share to Canadian producers who benefited from Carney's programs. This is economic judo. Trump applies pressure through tariffs. Carney uses that pressure to justify investments that permanently reduce Canadian vulnerability to future pressure. The harder Trump pushes, the faster Canada builds independence. Here's the political genius of this move. Carney announced this plan in a grocery store rather than at a farm. Why? Because Canadians are furious about food prices. Grocery costs are up 6.2% year over year. That's politically toxic. Carney can't stop inflation directly, but he can blame Trump for supply chain disruptions driving prices higher, and he can announce government action to protect Canadians from those disruptions. By framing the investment as protecting Canadians from Trump's tariffs, Carney makes it popular even with voters who might oppose government intervention in markets. Nobody wants higher grocery costs. If government spending can keep costs down while building Canadian food independence, that's a political winner. It also neutralizes conservative opposition. Opposition parties can't attack $500 million in spending without appearing to side with Trump against Canadian interests. So Carney gets to spend $500 million restructuring Canadian agriculture to be less dependent on the United States, and he gets credit for protecting grocery prices. Politically brilliant. Now let's talk about the American side of this equation. American agricultural growers and exporters are beginning to understand the long-term implications. Canada is a major export market for U.S. agricultural products. Fresh produce, processed foods, meat products, grains, billions in annual trade flow north. Much of that trade happens because Canada currently lacks domestic processing capacity or round-year production for certain products. Trump's tariffs gave Canada the political justification and economic incentive to build that capacity domestically. Every dollar Canada invests in greenhouses, processing facilities, and supply chain infrastructure represents future American exports disappearing permanently. Consider California growers who produce enormous quantities of tomatoes, peppers, and lettuce shipped to Canadian grocery stores. If Canada achieves self-sufficiency through greenhouse expansion, California growers lose a major export market forever. Some American agricultural groups actually lobbied against Trump's tariffs specifically because they understood these long-term market access implications. Trump ignored those concerns. He was focused on using tariffs as leverage for other political objectives. The result is exactly what American agricultural exporters feared. Canada is using Trump's tariffs as justification to build permanent domestic capacity that will reduce American market access for decades. And here's the thing, Trump can't stop this process. The investments are funded through Canadian government programs using Canadian money. They're happening in Canada using Canadian resources. Trump's only leverage is threatening more tariffs, which just reinforces the case for Canadian food independence. Even if Trump reverses tariff policies tomorrow, the investments won't stop. Once Canadian companies see the economic opportunity in serving domestic markets without cross-border trade complexity, they'll continue building capacity regardless of tariff status.
The $500 million food plan is only the first step. There's the expansion of the National School Food Program, providing meals to 400,000 children annually. That creates guaranteed demand for Canadian-produced food. There's the broader $70 billion Buy Canadian procurement initiative, including food purchases for government facilities, military bases, hospitals. There's ongoing negotiation with provinces to reduce interprovincial trade barriers for agricultural products. Currently, it's often easier for Canadian producers to export to the U.S. than sell to other provinces. And there's that China trade deal that unlocked $4 billion in canola exports to the world's largest consumer market. All of these initiatives create a Canadian food system that is more self-sufficient domestically and more diversified in export markets. The result? Permanent reduction in vulnerability to American tariff threats. Trump thought threatening Canadian agriculture would give him leverage. Instead, he catalyzed a transformation that makes Canada permanently less dependent on American markets and supply chains. Not leverage, strategic failure. The $500 million food plan is Canada turning Trump's biggest weapon into its greatest opportunity. And American agricultural exporters are just beginning to understand what they lost. If this analysis was valuable, make sure you're subscribed because we're tracking every move in this trade war. And let me know in the comments, do you think Canada can actually achieve food independence, or is this just political theater? Thanks for watching. I'll see you in the next one.